Hello everybody, I want to do a quick video. You may have heard the rumours that there was going to be a Hearthstone patch. It has just dropped live about 50 minutes ago from when I'm recording this. It was a really big patch, actually has way more impact than the last set had on the game, in my opinion. So there are some big changes that have been made, and a lot of them I think have been targeted at allowing starships to be played. I know, crazy thought. So starships in general, a few of those cards have been buffed, and some of the real big proponents of why you can't play starships have been nerfed, in some cases into the ground. We'll start with probably the most brutal one. Reno the Lone Ranger. It used to, if you had no duplicates in your deck, it would poof the entire enemy board and then only leave them one space for a turn. Now, it has been changed. No longer does it poof the entire board, it just removes all enemy minions from the game. Locations stay, dormant minions stay, starships stay. More importantly, to be honest with you with this card, portals and things like that stay as well, which is actually a humongous buff for Dragon Druid and for Control Warlock, because it means that now if you play Sargarius, your Nether portal, it's going to be really hard to remove that thing. So I expect both those sets to get a huge push because Reno doesn't exist anymore. There is a dev comment here saying like this card can be frustrating. I get the point of this card. To be honest with you, I felt like Reno was not a... It was a great card, sorry, but I don't think any of the decks that we're in were performing particularly great right now. But it's just one of those things that, like, its existence entirely just means the starships can't really work, because as soon as they get poofed off the board once, they sort of just lose the game. I think it's really a change that it's fine to make. I'm actually kind of surprised that they took away both the one space limit and the entire board poofing type effect at the same time. And if they were going to do this, I'm sure I was shocked they didn't take it back down to 8 mana. I think this is actually way too expensive now. I think this is not a good enough payoff to play a non-duplicate deck, unless your other non-duplicate card in your deck is actually worth carrying you as well. So a big hit to any Highlander deck out there. Reno, nowhere near as good as he once was. Lamplighter, oh my god, get the horns, get all the celebration, get the confetti. They've nerfed this card. It no longer has an infinite cap on damage. It's capped. It only does 4 damage now. So it's a 4/4 battle cry. If you played an elemental last turn, deal 4 damage. Rather than what it used to be, which was a 4/3, deal 1 damage improved by each turn in a row you played an elemental. Good change. I hated this card. I think it was a horrible design space for a card. If you're going to do something like this where you have to play a certain type of card every single turn for multiple turns to give you more and more damage, you have to make sure that there is some sort of downside to playing that type of card every single turn. There's no downside to elementals. In fact, there's an upside. Elementals want you to play cards every single turn, so you are just like self-proliferating goodness. And with a big win condition on it with the Lamplighter, because this often, like, you know, by the time you're getting like to turn 8, this thing is doing like 9 damage. It was so overpowered. And I think this is going to remove all those frustrating games where you play against an elemental mage, you feel like as a control deck, you've just got the board back again like around turn 7 or 8, and then they just drop double Lamplighter and you just explode. I hated this card. I'm glad they've capped it. Or I say capped it. They have just changed it to a flat amount of damage. I still think this is going to be pretty good with elemental mage, by the way, but obviously it is nowhere near as frightening now. It's only 4 rather than, 9 or 10 damage. Seabreeze Chalice. This has been nerfed. It no longer targets the face. It only hits minions. Basically kills this card completely. It's another Murdiddly-Durder. And what's funny is this card is seeing no play in Mage. It's only seen play in Druid. I think they got to the point where they're just fed up with this Owl OTK Druid deck with Mr. Vista, and they just wanted to get rid of the win condition. And the easiest way is Seabreeze Chalice doesn't hit the face. It's a horrible card now, so won't see any play, but if you didn't like that archetype, then you're happy, right? Conniving Conman has been reverted. It's no longer a non-rogue class card it replays. It's actually just a card from another class. Big, because this card is super powerful in... it's big in Big Spell Mage. It's also really important in the Earthen Paladin deck as well. Won't be anywhere near as good now that it's not a non-rogue card. It has to be a card from another class. Basically kills the card, to be honest with you, because this card wasn't seeing any play in rogue. It could still try in rogue, but there's just not enough... There's not a good enough like payoff for the Burgle package in Rogue, so I think Conman is basically just a dead card now. I mean, it didn't see any play before they changed it to non-Rogue. I don't see any reason why it would see play now with the addition of the starships. Similarly, Shill has also been reverted back to what it once was. It's no longer non-Rogue, it's another class. So again, this won't see play in Big Spell Mage anymore, this won't see play in Earthen Paladin anymore. This card won't see any play, full stop, because I don't think it's good enough to go into a Burgle Rogue deck, because I don't think a Burgle Rogue deck exists. So, they're some pretty big murderers, in my opinion. Sleep Under the Stars got 1 mana added to it. This is the card, again, that sees played in a lot of Druid decks, especially like the Mr. Vista Druid decks, where this gets recasted. It's also pretty good in the Arcane Druid deck, which isn't really performing as well as I was expecting it to do. I think of all the changes we've seen on here, this is probably the one that you could probably eat the most. At 8, it's still not a bad card in my opinion. Obviously nowhere near as good as it was at 7. I think one of the other big decks that runs this right now is Taunt, Warrior/Druid. And it's sort of a stabilization card. The fact it comes at 1 turn later makes it way harder to stabilize. So this is actually going to have a pretty big impact, but I still think Sleep Under the Stars will see play in the decks it saw playing before. Now we get to Quasar. Quasar has been changed from 6 mana to 8 mana. And actually, there's a really honest dev comment on here, which I'm going to read, because they basically own up that they've made a mistake here. Yeah or bad, every expansion we like to make a few dreamy cards that get players thinking about how far they can push the game. These cards aren't supposed to be the most competitively viable. The fun of them is wondering, what if? Quasar mostly fell into that category. It certainly got the dreamers cooking, and it hasn't turned out to be a competitive power outlier. But the experiences with this card does work. But the experiences when this card does work are too sharp and endgame's too early, turning the dream into a nightmare to play against. Very, very honest, I agree. I think this card should never have been printed. It was such an unhealthy card to print in Rogue. I said when I did the reveals that I gave this 5 stars. It never got to tier 1. No one ever got the deck to refine to a point where you could survive long enough to pull off the Quasar combo, and a few decks could gain enough health or enough armor to get away from the lethal condition. But this was a card that was always going to hinder what Rogue could get printed going forwards, because if Rogue ever got printed cards that deal damage, it would just break the game, right? This card will just break the game, so it was just too scary in Rogue to ever exist. It was going to limit the design space going forwards, and also, people did get the combos off against other decks that weren't Death Knights and weren't Warriors and maybe weren't Priests who can get a bit more health. And people were killing opponents on turn 4 with no counterplay. That is not a good idea. I mean, even if it's like a poor win rate, it's not a good idea. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the Lamplighter Rogue deck, where you bounce Lamplighter back a few times and just machine gun your opponent's face down. That deck didn't have a great win rate, but what it had was a really polarizing win rate, where it was like, against some decks it was unbelievably OP, and against other decks was unbelievably weak. I kind of want my decks to be in the middle a little bit. Like, I want to play games where maybe if I'm running a deck that's not favored, I have a chance of winning. But against the Quasar deck, I think some decks just were guaranteed to beat the Quasar deck, and some decks were not guaranteed to lose, but you could see where you would lose from that. So I just think Quasar was an unbalanceable card. It's just a horrible design. We've seen this before as well with stuff like the what's it called now? The Mage card, which Deck of Lunacy, like a Deck of Lunacy type effect. It's just so oppressive that you get to the point where eventually you just have to make the card absolutely garbage. It feels like the card can't ever be balanced. It's either incredibly OP or garbage. I don't think this was OP in the end at 6 mana, but it created this world where it could at some point have reached a critical mass of misery. And yeah, just not fun to play against. Like, I was really surprised they held the hands up and said, like, yeah, this is all bad. They've basically just put it at an amount that you won't play this card anymore. It just won't see play. It's too expensive. Everything Must Go. This has been nerfed by a mana as well. It's now 9 mana instead of 8 mana. This is because Cycle Rogue is really strong, even though on HS Replay and like through most of the ladder, not a lot of decks. I've not seen a lot of Cycle Rogue decks out there. At the top Legend, I believe this was the one that was performing the best. So they've kind of not preemptively, but they've hit the main deck with a nerf. And I think hitting Everything Must Go is a pretty reasonable hit compared to the other cards, because there are a few of the cycle cards and neutral cards which would go into other decks as well. So they're not hitting the other cycle decks that aren't working as well. They went very targeted for Rogue. This at least seems reasonable. I don't play that deck that often. It wouldn't shock me if this still sees some play, but there might have been a critical mass, and I don't know the list exactly, where this worked better with Sonya at 8, like it regularly came down to a 1 cost or something, where it might not anymore. So I'm not sure. It's obviously going to make it worse, but how much worse, I don't know. Multi-Magma no longer hits face, only hits minions. Actually a pretty big change. It was seeing a lot of play in a Burn Shaman deck, which is probably dead now without Multi-Magma to help do that extra bit of damage to the face. That being said, it's still a relatively solid control card, but realistically, Multi-Magma before this expansion, in my opinion, well, at least in my opinion, it was mainly seen playing like Razzle-Dazzle decks. Without the quality of the Razzle-Dazzle decks, which is, Razzle-Dazzle's been nerfed, do I think Multi-Magma is good enough to see play in its own right as a control card? Not really at 2 mana. I think it's a difficult one. I think it's a decent card, but it's not exciting anymore. Probably doesn't see any play, maybe in Highlander Shaman, but again, Reno's been nerfed, so I don't know if you'd run Highlander Shaman anymore. Pretty big change. Wave of Nostalgia has gone to 6 mana. I think this is actually pretty minor. I still think Wave of Nostalgia Shaman is going to be pretty strong. Obviously, having to wait one more turn is pretty important, especially if you're in an aggro v aggro matchup, as you might die while you're trying to set up the combo. Also going out to 6 means that control decks have more options of cards to play to counter the turn of Wave of Nostalgia, so it is a pretty big change. I expect it to hit the win rate considerably. I think this is a thumbs up. I think this card was too strong at 5, so 6, let's see how it performs. Another card I think was a fair change was Threads of Despair. It was like just good Defile, like better Defile. Defile was a pretty good card at 2. Threads, very good at dealing with all those aggressive decks out there. It's going to be slightly less good with 1 mana added onto it. I still think the card's actually really solid. I still think you'll see some play, but not quite as oppressive. And actually, when you go to these elemental mages that obviously have been nerfed because of Lamplighter, I imagine Threads of Despair was one of the big despairing cards for those decks. And it getting 1 mana added onto it means you could push more damage faster, and maybe makes up for that Lamplighter change in the matchup of a controlled Death Knight versus you as the Elemental Mage. So maybe that matchup is actually pretty similar to what it was once before. Other big change, Reska has 5 mana added to it. Bearing in mind, Reska gets a discount for every minion that dies during the game. Do I think 5 mana addition to the Reska is going to matter? No, I actually don't think it will do. I suspect in most of the decks that you run Reska, you typically run it with a lot of cards that get killed, right? So my gut feeling is normally by the time I want Reska up, it's already 0 mana. I'm going to guess it's going to still be around 0 mana when you want to play your Reska. Again, it's hard to tell in these like ginormous mana things where they get discounts for gameplay things happening. It really depends on the matchup. It depends on the meta as well to some degree, but as long as Reska is like coming out even at 3 mana, it's still a really good card. This card I think was hit as well because Starships, they just can't play into Reska, because Reska just steals your Starship. You play all these garbage cards for the big payoff of playing this one big Starship, and then Reska just steals it for 3 mana. I still think that is going to be oppressive. I actually still think this is going to be a big barrier to entry for the Starships, that Reska will still be strong enough to deal with that. Another murder, Funnel Cake, was 1 mana, now 2 mana. Priest has maybe 2 viable decks right now. One of them is Zarimi Priest, which is okay. It was really good. After some nerfs, it's a little bit lower than it once was. The other deck that we're seeing some play was some psychotic overheal Priest deck, where you just gained a big board of minions and kept buffing the stats with overheal effects. If you got controlled or like somewhat board cleared early on, you were just automatically losing that deck. So it was a bit of a not flaky deck, so to speak. It had like a reasonable win rate. Like I think it actually was probably approaching a tier 1 deck, if not hitting the tier 1 region. So not a complete shock to see a card nerfed from it. However, Priest has 1 draw engine. Like, the entire class has 1 draw engine, which is Crimson Clergy plus healing. And ideally, you would want to get some Crimson Clergies together, and you'd use Funnel Cake to overheal, and gain mana crystals to let you do more overhealing to give you more cards. That is the only draw engine Priest has. Look it up. Look at Priest cards with draw in it. They don't exist. It's simply not a thing. Putting 1 mana on Funnel Cake just makes it considerably worse. It makes it less likely to chain onto other heals to let you draw more cards to play more things. So it's a huge nerf to Priest, like a colossal nerf to Priest. I think as big as Reno nerf was to Reno decks or Highlander decks, Funnel Cake to Priest, this is actually probably an equivalent nerf because this card saw a lot of play in basically every Priest deck. Druid ran it occasionally. I don't think it's as popular in the Druid decks. But Druid didn't really need the overheal. It was just for mana cheat. But Druid has better ways to mana cheat. So this, I think, hits Priest more. And it hits Priest pretty hard considering Priest, outside those two decks, basically doesn't exist as a class. Like, it's got such a huge drop-off. But we'll see what Priest can do with some of their buffed cards. Mystery Egg. It used to get you a copy of a random beast in your deck on a death rattle, and it cost 4 less. It now costs 3 less. I'm kind of surprised with this. I thought it was going to revert it to 5 mana and a 5 mana discount, but no, they're going to keep the speed of it, but with a lower discount on it. Again, I don't play a lot of Mystery Egg Hunter or Breakfast Hunter. I suspect this is a pretty big deal since it seems like this boundary, like the 5 mana 5 discount was too slow. 4 mana 4 was like just about right to be like a tier 2-ish deck. I don't think Breakfast Hunter really ever got into tier 1. Taking 1 mana discount off it probably means that you don't necessarily get to play the cheated minion out immediately, which could be a pretty big deal. But we'll wait and see. There's also like part of my brain cells where it's like, if you play Mystery Egg on 4, you trigger it on 5 or something to, you know, break it. Then as long as you're playing a beast that is 8 or less on the next turn, you can just play it. And actually 9 or less, because you'd be on 6 mana crystals. If you can break it on the turn that you play it, then again, it's going to be an 8 mana or less on 5 to play it on curve. So it feels like it's going to be not that bad. Like, it feels very minor. So I don't know. I don't play a lot of Breakfast Hunter. I don't know how much big a deal this mana cheat is going to be. 1 less mana. My gut instinct feels like it will still curve okay. So probably a slightly minor change. It might be stuff like, you know, where you try to put Yormonger or something on one of your cleaves or something like that. I think that's occasionally runs into that deck. You might not be able to do that anymore with the mana discount, or the lack of mana discount. Finally, I don't really want to mention this because this is wild for the nerfs, so to speak. Ordering the Court's been reverted. It goes back to draw a card on top of it. In case you're wondering why that was the case, people were using Holy Wrath with Ceaseless Expanse to do 100 damage to opponents' faces on turn 5. And that wasn't very balanced. Even in Wild, that was a little bit too strong. And part of the reason why it was so strong was that Ordering the Court, it reordered your deck to make sure that the 100 cost card would be on top of the deck, so you knew that when you played Holy Wrath, you would do 100 damage. That wasn't very fair. So they've gone back to what Order in the Court used to be, which was reorder your deck and draw a card, which means the Ceaseless Expanse would go into your hand. And currently there is no minion more expensive than Ceaseless Expanse, and I doubt they'll print another minion in that ballpark region. So you can't stack the deck anymore in the way that you would like it. So you can't have this incredibly expensive OTK mana cost card on the top of your deck anymore. Funnily enough, part of the reason why this was nerfed this way was because in Standard, you would draw a Sea Giant, right, in the Flood Paladin deck, and you could just instantly play the Sea Giant for 0, normally when you played your Order in the Court. So that's why it got nerfed to remove the draw. And it's calling this a nerf right now, but it's just a nerf to the only deck that used to run this card, which is the Ceaseless Expanse Holy Wrath Paladin. And also Ceaseless Expanse is now back in Wild again. Okay, now we get to the buffs. Ascara in Drainy Priest. It was a 5 mana 4/5, it's now a 4 mana 4/4. LOL. If only Priest had Draenei that were worth copying. Deirdre Rebel Captain. It now shuffles 8 crewmates into your deck, and Death Rattle, you draw 2 of them instead. It's actually a pretty big change. This card was kind of garbage. I mean, the crewmate Among Us deck wasn't very good, full stop. I actually tried this once off camera, and it felt super, super underwhelming in the end. Deirdre, though, giving you 2 crewmate draws is actually pretty big. Next turn, you could play your crewmate, and you're at least guaranteed to get 8/8 in stats outright for 4 mana, depending on the card that you draw when your turn comes around. So not an inconceivably good card here. I still think it's pretty bad just because it's so slow that it puts the 8 crewmates into your deck, and drawing a crewmate, generally speaking, is not a good draw. It's a 4 mana 4/4, right? I still think it's garbage, but it's less garbage than it was before. At least you're going to get 1 pretty good turn afterwards, I think. Voronoi Recruiter has got 1 attack added to it. Fine. This archetype was super underwhelming. I think that makes sense to put it into a normal stat line. Alright, one of the big ones, Libram Paladin, Interstellar Star Slicer, not a 2-3 anymore, it's a 3-2. That's a huge change because realistically with the Interstellar Star Slicer, you want to break it as soon as it's humanly possible to get the Libram discount so they can play the Librams discounted to 0 cost, because then they get a superior effect. It was really painful to break the weapon with 3 swings, and it was so painful that I would actually re-up the weapon before I finished attacking with the first one. Like, I'd purposely lose some value. Now you're less incentivized to do that because 3-2 stat line on a weapon, not a bad stat line. You're going to get 6 damage from it like you did before, but over 2 turns instead of 3 turns. And you'll get the death rattle up a little bit faster. So I think this is a really good change. It makes it a bit more aggressive. Good thumbs up. I like that change. Yrel used to be a 5-mana 4-3. It's now a 4-mana 3-3. I kind of think this is a kind of irrelevant change to some degree. The stat line is better because it's 4-mana with 6 stats rather than 5-mana with 7 stats. But it doesn't really move the needle that much. It doesn't really make a huge difference that you got the Librams from the older timeline up earlier. Wave Hands, yeah, it's okay. It's probably fine considering you want to buff this card, so it leaves you some mana over to buff the card as well, but you had to rush it and kill it, so it doesn't really matter. I don't know. I think it's a really weird change. I think it's a very sideways change to this card, but we'll see how Libram Paladin performs now with these changes. Felfire Thrusters has 1 health added to it. Alright, Shatari Cloakfield has had 1 health added to it. Okay, Shatari Cloakfield having 1 health added to it is actually a bit more important than this Felfire Thrusters. Really weird they gave this 1 additional health when its effect is based on attack. Also, the Warlock one is probably the weakest of the starships, debatably, considering you can't get the damage to go face because it has to hit minions. So you could kind of give it, like, a bit more of a push with its attack. But no, they gave it 1 health, which is just super irrelevant. At least you're playing 3-mana 6 stats, not 3-mana 5 stats, which was horrible. Shatari Cloakfield in the Druid deck, I still don't think this goes in the Arcane Druid list. But an elusive minion is hard to deal with because you can't target with spells. Giving it more health makes it harder to trade out with other minions. So there is some logic to this change. I don't think it's as crazy as the Felfire Thruster one, but not good enough. What I don't think is crazy is actually this Gravitational Displacer. It was a 4-3, it's now a 5-4. That's actually a humongous change because I basically said you can't play a 5-mana 4-3 in current Hearthstone in Standard. You will just do a die. And generally speaking, you did a die whenever you played this card. It was just such a huge tempo loss, especially considering most of the Rogue Starship package is discovering starships from other classes, which in itself is also slow. So it was just super, super slow. If you could launch a starship and get, this huge value turn, it was fantastic, but you just couldn't do it against like 90% of the decks out there. And like the other 10% of the decks just poof this guy away. I think with the change to Reno, I think with the change to like the Lamplighter and stuff to make some of the aggro decks a little bit less punchy, this being a 5-mana 5-4 is actually something you could legitimately play and eat up the tempo loss. It's still a tempo loss turn, but it's not completely insane. I suspect that deck is still garbage, but I will certainly try that out now. Starship Schematic has also been changed for Rogue. They're really trying to push this Rogue Starship package. You now discover a Starship from another class, which costs 1 less. Very good, because again, you take a huge tempo loss discovering it with the spell. You kind of mitigate it now with the 1 mana discount on the spell. It's sort of like a 0 mana spell, which is pretty good. Also in Rogue, Scrounging Shipwright is not a death rattle anymore, it's a battle cry. Very good. It was terrible as a death rattle. Again, super, super slow. Battle cry, you get it up faster. Very good. Good change. I like it. Still think the whole package is not very good, but it's going to be a fun package. I'll give it that. It's going to be fun. Exodar was an 8-mana 6/10. It's now a 7-mana 6/8. It lets you play Exodar early, which means you get this big armor chunk, because I feel like the Exodar mainly gives you this big armor chunk because you're playing a slower deck. If you're playing into a fast deck, you might need that armor sooner to live. I think this is a pretty big change. I think it's a big nerf to basically every aggro deck. And I do think Starships will see a lot more play because of these changes. They do say they're going to keep an eye out on this. I can kind of see why. I can see some worlds where some classes could gain an absolute metric fuck ton of armor from this. So watch this space. Ace Wayfinder was a 5-mana 5/5, now 4-mana 4/4. good. I don't think it's going to see that much play instead, but it's better to, get this card out a little bit faster. So, watch this space. Not particularly exciting, though. Dimensional Core. The other Starship piece for the neutral cards that no one ever seemed to play because it was garbage. It was a 3-mana 3/2, it's now a 2-mana 2/2. Playable. Actually playable. 2-mana 2/2 Divine Shield is not completely crazy. It's bad, but it's not completely crazy. So if you're a deck with a Starship where you want the piece to live for multiple turns, a la Rogue, for example, you might want to put a Dimensional Core in there just to give your guy a bit of Divine Shield protection. So I think this card will still see a little bit less play than the other neutral card, but I definitely can see people teasing in a copy of it. And then finally, Astral Vigilant got 1 health. Maybe the most irrelevant change of all times, because realistically, the big thing about Astral Vigilant was you wanted to get the last copy of a Dread Eye that you played. The 1 health is super, super minor. Anyway, that is my quick lowdown of the patch. Watch this space, because I'm going to be playing some more of the Starship decks, and actually just in general, more decks from the new expansion. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time. Bye.